What are your 3 favorite EQ plugins? Now, the reason I've done this video multiple times and I always get asked this, and my answer changes every couple of months. And I do like to switch plugins about every now and then. It keeps things a little bit more interesting, and there's reasons why I go back to certain plugins and I use certain plugins. But there is one that is in every video I've ever done on what free EQ plugins do you use. There's one that stays in there every single time, and that's FabFilter Pro Q3. Just because it's got such a great GUI, great EQ, pretty standard, nothing special really, but it does everything. It literally does everything, and it has a great GUI and a great analyzer in it. So that's one that I will always say, that's one that I use all the time. The other one is, at the moment, is Tone Project's the Michelangelo EQ. Now that's a really good EQ. The reason I use that is because there's actually 2 reasons why. I've recently got the Michelangelo XL that we built, so I've got to know that EQ really well. Now, when I first picked up the Michelangelo plugin, I didn't enjoy it as much as I do now, and there's a reason for that. And the simple reason is where I've got the hardware, I've got to know it so well. Where you get hands-on with something, you get to know it really well. Then when you take your knowledge of hardware into the plugin, you work with the plugin totally differently. So using the hardware, knowing the hardware, you automatically understand and know the plugin far better than if you were to use the plugin and not use the hardware. I don't think it goes the other way. I don't think you use the plugin and get to know the plugin and then know the hardware. I don't think that works, because it certainly didn't work with me. And using the hardware, getting to really know that, I can work with the plugin so well because I can use it in a very similar way. So that's one that I'm using a lot at the moment, and I'm using it a lot as more than just an EQ. The other thing that really kind of highlighted what is possible and got me to understand the hardware a lot more was I used Plugin Doctor a lot to run through it and actually understand what the curves are doing, and by turning the highs up, how it affects the mids, and how the mids affects the low, and how the aggression affects things like that. And then also understanding the calibration on it with the tubes, how they affect the situation. So there's a lot to understand with that. It's not, the thing with that plugin is, if you don't understand it, you could go way the other way. You could go to a point where you're making the wrong decisions. It's not like a standard EQ. It's very good though. So that's another EQ that I use. So I'm using the FabFilter Pro Q3, and I'm using the Tone Project's Michelangelo. 2 very good EQs. The other one, the third EQ that I use all the time at the moment, is the Eventide Split EQ. Now, the reason for that is I don't like to double up on EQs too much. I like, if I'm using an EQ where I want to be quite surgical, I want to be quite clean, I don't want to color the sound too much, FabFilter, brilliant for that. If I want to color the sound and I want to add more of a musical EQ, I'm using the Tone Project's Michelangelo. Split EQ, totally different to both of those. You've got, it splits it's unique in the way that it splits the EQ into 2. So you have tone, and then you have transients, or dynamics, I think they call it. And you can work with either within the same band. So you can work with tone and the kind of balance between tone and dynamics, which is really good. So it works, in some ways, it works similar to a transient designer in specific frequencies. So it's very good for that. And then it's also a great sounding EQ, but it's ultimately, the 3 EQs that I've listed off are free EQs that are totally different from each other. They all have a very different purpose, and it's much like everything in my mastering chain. Each EQ has, I've got 8 EQs in here. Each one does a very specific thing, and that's the same with plugins. And I think that's a good way to work, because if you've got 3 EQs that are all doing the same thing, it's like, which one do you go for? It's like, what different curves? And I like to pick 3. If I do pick 3 EQs and had to pick 3 EQs, I pick 3 that are totally different from each other. And yeah, so FabFilter Pro Q3, that's always in this list at the moment. Tone Project's Michelangelo, and the Eventide Split EQ. 3 really good EQs.